Beijing, 1860. British and French troops stand in the Summer Palace, one of the most magnificent architectural achievements in human history. 200 buildings, gardens that took 150 years to create, art collections spanning millennia. Lord Elgin gives the order, "Burn it." 3,500 soldiers spend 3 days reducing it to ash. The message was clear: submit, accept Western dominance, break. China didn't break. Here's what your history books probably skipped. For 200 years, Western powers have tried to break China. Drugs, division, isolation, economic pressure. Every single strategy eventually failed. Every one. You've watched this pattern your entire life. When you were doing duck and cover drills, China was the sick man of Asia. When you watched Nixon land in Beijing, China was still recovering. Now, second largest economy on Earth, largest manufacturing base, military that makes Pentagon planners nervous. That transformation wasn't luck, and the repeated Western failures weren't accidents either. There's a pattern here, one that explains why current strategies face the same problems as strategies from 1839. Let's document what Western governments actually tried, not opinions, historical record. Attempt 1. Break them through drugs. 1839 to 1860. Britain had a trade problem. They wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. China wanted nothing Britain made. Silver was flowing out of British coffers at $20 to $34 million annually. That's according to British parliamentary records, not Chinese claims. So British merchants found something China would buy: opium grown in colonial India. When the Chinese government tried to stop the drug trade, burning 20,000 chests of opium in 1839, Britain declared war. Not to defend free trade, to force a nation to accept drug imports at gunpoint. Britain won. Twice. Took Hong Kong, forced open ports, created what historians estimate as 4 to 12 million addicts by mid-century. British parliamentary records from the 1840s document this. They were proud of it at the time. The theory? Addiction would weaken Chinese society enough to make it controllable. Attempt 2. Break them through division. 1895 to 1945. After the Opium Wars, Western powers carved China into spheres of influence. Britain got the Yangtze Valley. France got the South. Germany got Shandong. Russia got Manchuria. Japan took Taiwan, then invaded the mainland. By 1900, 8 nations, Britain, France, the US, Germany, Russia, Japan, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, jointly invaded Beijing. 50,000 foreign troops occupied the capital. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 demanded 450 million taels in reparations, over 1,300% of China's annual tax revenue at the time. The theory: a divided China, crushed by debt, playing foreign powers against each other, would never reunify or resist. Attempt 3. Break them through isolation. 1949 to 1972. When Mao won in 1949, Western strategy shifted. Containment, economic isolation, no recognition, trade embargoes, military encirclement. If you grew up during the Cold War, you remember Red China was the enemy, communist, dangerous, isolated. The theory: cut off from Western trade, technology, and recognition, China would collapse or capitulate. Attempt 4. Break them through economic integration. 1972, present. Nixon's visit in 1972 marked a strategic reversal. The new theory: bring China into the global economic system and veil democratize. Trade will create a middle class. The middle class will demand political reform. Capitalism will defeat communism from within. When China joined the WTO in 2001, you heard the predictions. China will become more like us. Officials said it publicly. When that didn't happen, strategy shifted again. Tariffs, technology restrictions, sanctions, financial pressure. The theory: economic pain will force policy changes. The drug strategy seemed effective at first. Millions addicted, government weakened, treaties signed at gunpoint. But here's what the strategists missed. Scale defeats concentrated pressure. China's population in 1850, roughly 430 million. Even 12 million addicts, a horrifying number, represented less than 3% of the population. Devastating for those families, not enough to collapse a civilization. Trauma creates determination, not submission. Chinese historical memory absorbed the Opium Wars not as a lesson in Western superiority, but as the beginning of what they call the century of humiliation. Every Chinese schoolchild today learns about the Opium Wars, not as ancient history, as the wound that explains everything that came after. The British burned the Summer Palace to break Chinese will. Instead, they created a grievance that unified Chinese nationalism for generations. Julia Lovell, the Harvard historian, documented this in the Opium War. Western powers thought they were teaching China a lesson about power. China learned a different lesson: never be weak enough for this to happen again. By 1937, China was divided: nationalists versus communists, warlords controlling provinces, Japan occupying Manchuria and invading the coast. On paper, China was broken. But here's what division strategies missed. Cultural unity runs deeper than political division. China isn't a nation-state in the European sense. It's a civilization state. 4,000 years of continuous written history, shared language, written Chinese, unified communication even when spoken dialects differed, shared cultural references, shared historical memory. When China was politically fragmented, Chinese people still considered themselves Chinese. The question was never whether China would reunify, only who would do it and how. Foreign pressure unifies internal factions. Japanese invasion did something remarkable. It forced nationalists and communists into temporary alliance. External threat trumped internal division. This pattern repeats. When Western pressure intensifies today, internal Chinese critics of the government often rally to nationalist positions. Outside pressure doesn't divide China, it unifies it. From 1949 to 1972, Western isolation strategy faced a basic problem. China is too large to completely isolate. The Soviet Union provided an alternative. China had enough population and resources to pursue self-sufficiency, however painfully. The Great Leap Forward was a catastrophe, but it proved China could survive without Western trade. Isolation eventually became more costly to the isolators. By the early 1970s, American strategists realized something. A billion-person market, permanently hostile and allied with the Soviets, served no Western interest. Nixon's visit wasn't charity, it was strategic recalculation. Here's what isolation actually achieved. It gave China 2 decades to develop without Western economic penetration. When China did open up, it opened on its own terms, with institutions already in place to manage foreign investment. You're watching this strategy play out right now. Tariffs, technology restrictions, financial sanctions, decoupling. The pattern suggests why this faces challenges. The economy is too large and interconnected. China's GDP in 2023, approximately $17.7 trillion, according to IMF data. That's not a small economy you can pressure into submission. That's the manufacturing base for half the world's goods. Western companies have trillions invested in Chinese operations. Supply chains run through Chinese factories. Decoupling isn't impossible, but it's expensive for everyone. China saw this coming and prepared. Look at Chinese policy since 2015. Made in China 2025, domestic semiconductor production. Belt and Road Initiative, alternative trade networks. BRICS expansion, alternative financial systems. Massive investments in domestic consumption to reduce export dependence. Were these responses to future pressure, or responses to pressure China expected based on 200 years of experience? World Bank data shows China's domestic consumption as percentage of GDP rising steadily. They're building an economy that's harder to pressure from outside. That's not paranoia, that's pattern recognition. Historical memory shapes current policy. When Chinese leaders discuss economic policy, they reference the Opium Wars. When they discuss technology independence, they reference the century of humiliation. When they discuss military development, they reference the Eight-Nation Alliance. This isn't propaganda for domestic consumption, though it serves that purpose too. It's genuine institutional memory shaping strategic calculation. American policymakers rotate every 4 to 8 years. Chinese strategic planning operates on different timescales. They remember what worked against them. They build countermeasures. Step back and look at 200 years of Western strategies toward China. A pattern emerges. China is too large. Pressure that would break a smaller nation gets absorbed by continental scale. 1.4 billion people, diverse economy, multiple regions, strategic depth. China is too culturally unified. Political divisions come and go. Cultural identity persists. Pressure from outside reinforces internal unity rather than fragmenting it. China has institutional memory. Every strategy used against China gets studied, documented, taught in schools, and planned against. They remember the Opium Wars. They remember the unequal treaties. They remember isolation. China builds alternatives to every pressure point. Dependent on Western technology? Build domestic capacity. Dependent on dollar system? Build alternative payment systems. Dependent on export markets? Develop domestic consumption. This isn't brilliant or mysterious. It's logical. If you got burned badly enough, repeatedly, you'd plan against it, too. You've watched this entire transformation with your own eyes. When you were young, made in China meant cheap plastic toys. Now it means 5G infrastructure, high-speed rail, and electric vehicles. You watched China go from famine to food exporter, from bicycles to space stations, from isolation to the center of global manufacturing. And you watched Western strategy after Western strategy fail to prevent it. Drugs created addiction and lasting determination. Division weakened China temporarily, then unified it permanently. Isolation delayed development, then made China more self-sufficient. Current economic pressure is met with countermeasures developed specifically because China studied every previous attempt. Here's the uncomfortable pattern. Every time Western governments declared a new strategy to weaken China, Chinese planners asked, what did they try before? Why did it fail? How do we prepare? Does understanding this pattern mean approving of everything China does? No. The Chinese government does things worthy of criticism. But understanding why certain strategies don't work, that's different from moral approval. That's pattern recognition. That's learning from 200 years of documented failure. The world your grandchildren inherit will be shaped by this pattern. Not because China is good or bad, because China is large, unified, has long memory, and builds alternatives to every pressure. The question isn't whether Western governments will try new strategies. They will. The question is whether they'll recognize the pattern or repeat it. 200 years of evidence suggests a certain answer. But patterns can break if you understand them.